Well, the question is what would have happened to slavery? Okay, the main question he was asking is what would have happened to slavery had it not been ended by a war? In my writings, I point out that the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the French, the Danes, they all ended slavery peacefully, one way or another, through some kind of compensated emancipation. Slavery was ended in New York City in the early 1850s. There was no war involved. New England did not go to war over slavery. They ended it. New England began phasing out slavery in 1794, and there were still, I think it was New Hampshire, still passed a new law outlawing slavery in 1857. There's a book on this by Joanne Pope Mellish called Disowning Slavery, if anyone's interested. I think Jeffrey Hummel, in his book Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Free Men, gives a good economic explanation of what likely would have happened. And what he says is what likely would have happened was what happened in Brazil, where slavery was ended in the northern provinces of Brazil, and that essentially broke the economic back of slavery, because a slave in the next province south only had to escape to the next province north to be free forever. But we in America had the Fugitive Slave Act, which put a bounty on the heads of escaped slaves. That's why the Underground Railroad ended up in Canada. And Lincoln was a very strong supporter of the Fugitive Slave Act. So just ending this, and of course the secession of the southern states ended the Fugitive Slave Act. And so that a slave from Virginia that made it into Pennsylvania no longer had a federal bounty on his head and would be free forever. And that would have made slavery uneconomical, I think, because it was the cost of enforcement of the slave system were socialized by the Fugitive Slave Act. And I think Hummel got it right. No one can predict how long it would have taken. But I reviewed a book recently. Charles Adams's latest book is a collection of essays from European journals on the Civil War. Charles Dickens is in there and all. It's wonderful, wonderful writing, the mostly British authors. These are all the original articles. And almost every one of them recognized this, because most of them said, well, this war is not about slavery, because after all, by seceding, the South is giving up on slavery, because they know the Fugitive Slave Act is no longer intact. And so it was widely recognized around the world then that this is probably what would have happened, that slavery would have ended by economic means. And I argue in my writing that a real statesman could have hurried the process along and done more like what the British did by getting serious about compensated emancipation. I have some libertarians have sort of screamed and yelled at me over the injustice of taxing somebody and using tax dollars to give to a slaveholder. And they seem incapable of understanding the principle of opportunity cost, because the principle is, well, compared to what? I mean, yeah, that's unjust to take money out of the man's pocket and give it to a slave owner, but compared to drafting him into the military and killing him in a war, it's not such a bad deal. And so that's the way I look at it, is it's a lesser of two evils, and it's how the rest of the world in the 19th century got rid of slavery, is through some sort of compensated emancipation. But I think the reason we didn't do it that way is the slaves were always intended to be used as pawns in the American Civil War, and which they were. And that's what Lincoln always said, his famous letter to Horace Greeley. He said, if I could save the Union by freeing no slaves, I would do that. If I could free some and leave others in bondage, I would do that too. That was always his position. Time for Well, there are many reasons. Like as Ivan mentioned, the Upper South originally stayed in the Union. Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, Tennessee. It wasn't until Lincoln called for 75,000 troops to invade their sister states that the Upper South seceded. They originally voted to stay in. And I think the Lower South, I think they were slavery was much more an important issue, but I think it was agitation over slave rebellions that was being encouraged by some in the North that mostly that they were mostly afraid of, because slavery was constitutional. The Dred Scott decision, as bad as it was, it sort of cemented into place for a while that slavery was constitutional. You had Abe Lincoln saying, I have no opposition to an amendment that would expressly make slavery constitutional. And so I really can't believe that they thought there was a constitutional crisis with regard to slavery. But I think the inciting of rebellions was what they were mostly interested in. And of course, the big opposition was to of the North was the extension of slavery. It wasn't Southern slavery. Southern slavery wasn't criticized by the Republican Party platform at all. It was the extension of slavery. And you only have to read Lincoln's words and the words of other prominent Republicans at the time. And they said if slavery is extended, it will artificially inflate the representation of the Democratic Party, because there was the 3/5 clause of the Constitution at the time that said every 5 slaves counted as 3 people for purposes of determining how many members of Congress there would be in each state. So when the territories became states, there would be too many Democrats, they said. And they said it over, I quote quite a few of them. I even quote Ohio Congressman Joshua Giddings saying, we can't let this happen. We can't let the extension of slavery. It'll skew the votes. And why is that a bad thing? Well, because we then can't get our tariff. We can't get a protectionist tariff, and that's an abomination that we can't get a protectionist tariff by this. And so it was linked to the extension of slavery was the bigger issue, I think, as far as that goes. I think so. I think the lower South would have been isolated economically and would have been forced into ending slavery, especially if a real statesman came along and applied a lot of pressure and got the Europeans also involved in applying pressure on the lower South. I think that's the scenario that is very likely to would have happened as far as peaceful elimination of slavery. But the Emancipation Proclamation that specifically exempted all the areas of the country where the Union Army was in control or which were a part of the Union, they were all exempted from the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln's position was always, you can keep your slaves as long as you keep paying federal taxes and stay in the Union. That was always his position, for example. And most people don't know this. One more. I guess this man has been standing up for a while. Only one case at a time? Yes. Well, you need to start. Well, first of all, you need to start buying more than one case at a time of my books and giving them, educating yourself, like Richard Ebeling said. But yeah, it's 140 years of propaganda. There was a book published last year, the last thing I'll say, called Lincoln's Melancholy, about his mental illnesses. He suffered from depression. He took drugs that had a heavy dose of mercury in them. Today's doctors will tell you this sort of thing will lead to wild mood swings. Lincoln himself believed he had syphilis. And this book is all about his various mental illnesses. He quit carrying a knife with him as a young man for fear he would kill himself. He talked about suicide all the time, even in the White House. The History Channel did a show about this book. And I blogged on Lew Rockwell's website before the show came out. I hadn't seen it. I forecasted, here's the spin. They're going to say he's even greater than we thought because despite being mentally ill, look what he achieved. And sure enough, that's exactly what was made. I look at these same facts. And I say, oh my God, a crazy man was elected president and invaded his own country. That's the way I look. That's the way I look at it. I guess our time is up.